Well, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us. I am Yori Folare. As we always do, we talk about things national here, and even if the men were to say that they don't know about it, even that, I don't think there will be too many men. Our women certainly know about it because they go to the market, and wanted to talk about food inflation this morning. Well, first of all, with inflation in the phrase food inflation, we have a very good idea of what it is. But inflation itself, according to the National Bureau of Statistics, they say as of July, they found that Nigeria had an inflation rate of 22.02%. Well, I have a couple of experts to help us, well, also put that in perspective, but also talk about the food inflation and what can be done about it. Do we have to bear it, or are there policies that could be implemented to sort of ameliorate it? In any case, let me introduce my guests. Right here in studio is Dr. Olukayode Oluleye. I beg your pardon, Dr. Olukayode Oyeleye.
Yes, good morning.
Dr. Oyeleye is consultant and policy analyst. He's also a former senior special advisor to two successive ministers of Agric. A fine morning to you, sir, Dr.
Good morning.
Olukayode
Good morning,
Oyeleye.
sir.
Indeed. And remotely, we're also delighted to have Professor Ken Ife. Professor Ken Ife is a development economist. Good morning to you, Prof.
Oh, hi, good morning.
Now, let me start with you, being as you're remote and all of that. Let me start with you. Help us out, please. If we go with the figures of the Bureau of Statistics saying that as of June, they have recorded a 22.02% inflation generally. But because we're narrowing down now into food inflation, does that have a separate index, or is what we know for the figure we know for inflation, does it also work with food inflation, or can they differ from each other?
Well, there are 5 indices that measure inflation. The overall summary of it, the aggregation of all of them, is called the headline inflation. That is the composite price index. Is a weighted average. Now that has come down at 20.77%. It marginally increased in August from 20.52 to 20.77. It's a very small increase, much smaller than the previous month, because the previous month had a much larger, almost 1%. Now the second one, which is also quite popular, is called core inflation. Core inflation is all indices minus the most volatile element, which is food sub-basket index. A food sub-basket index is currently at 23.34%. That is the highest, and it's been the highest for years.
Okay.
It always gives a headroom of 3 to 5% to the headline. The core itself, when you remove the volatile one, is 17.560%. That's the lowest of the 5 indices.
Okay.
Now, there are 2 other ones. One is called urban sub-index and rural sub-index. The urban sub-index has been quite up of late and is 21.25, which for the second or third time has gone higher than the average one, which is a headline. And then the rural one is 20.32, which is slightly below the average. Now, what does the two tell you? The urban one being much higher tells you that the theater of inflation is in the urban area. And this is because you have much of the imported inflation in the urban area. You know, the imported food, all
That's
these
right.
things, that consumption, they carry a lot of inflation with them. So there are more pronounced consumption in the urban area. They also have transport costs of transporting goods from rural area to urban area. And the transport is very, very high now. and is pushing up all the input costs. So that shows you that a lot of the things, and then of course that things like electricity, telephony, they all consume more in the urban area, and they're also showing signs of increase. So that's why you have that disparity between the two of them. But the food is the one that we need to focus our attention to, because if you look at the food in August, it actually decreased. The rate of increase of food decreased in September, much lower than it did in the corresponding period last year, and then also than it did in August. So what it tells you is that the food, because we're in a harvest season, we're harvesting, so the harvest is bringing down the price of food. But you can only say it up to today. I tell you that the next result you are going to get for next month is going to be considerably higher because of the flood. And we really need to tackle this issue, because the flood has hit us below the belt. Now, and it is worse in the area of rice. Worse because most of the rice fields are in the flood-prone areas, and it's serious. It's really serious, because you're not only taking down the rice, and you're talking about tens of thousands of hectares of rice. They will not only that is taking them down and sending the people to somewhere in refugee camps, but the big refiners and the millers that we have encouraged and poured in a lot of CBN intervention fund to encourage them to build capacity and employ are also heavily affected. So we must be looking, the likes of Holland. Holland has lost more than 8,000 hectares of rice in Nasarawa State, in the around Nasarawa River, Niger, Plateau. So it's lost that around that Benue area basin. So that is serious. And if we are thinking about just the people who are farming and the rice itself, then you are going to miss the big picture, because the big picture is to keep the jobs of those who are milling the rice so that they can feed those who are growing the rice. You know what I mean? So we have to target body, immediately give money, not to any merchant. Give license to those who are milling rice to go and bring in paddy and meal so that they can keep the jobs. And then they can now support the farmers that have been displaced and those who are growing rice. If you do it any other way, we just exacerbate the problem. If you just allow traders to import already milled rice, you are not going to help this country.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for that opener, Prof. Coming to you, Dr. Oyele. Well, the Prof has explained the various kinds of inflation and where it's at now. It's good to know, because that's what science and statistics, that's what they're for. So you can have a general overview of what's going on. He explained that there's rural, there's also urban inflation.
Right.
And I think it stands to reason, as he has explained, that, look, in the urban, the kind of foods, the kind of consumption in the urban area is much different from those in the rural areas. But even those in the rural area, and let me just take it from the point of view of local food sellers. I imagine they'll be in the majority, not to talk about all the fast food joints and all those kind of prices. Even those, the alamala, the bukaterias, they in the rural areas, can we say that they are not seeing it? Because everybody, whether rural, whether local, whether rural, whether urban, is saying that they know that things are not the same, especially in the urban areas, as our Prof explained. But are they insulated then? Because they might not be too interested in, the kind of fare that you saw the videos of, because they tend to be more fresh, they tend to come from farm into the kitchen. Explain that to us, if you will, please. And also the extent to which you rely, well, I don't know, you're a scientist yourself, an economist. I was going to say the extent to which you rely on statistics that we get from MBS.
Okay, so first let's talk about whether or not these rural dwellers are insulated. They are not. They're generally an integral part of the economy, and the day-to-day happenings within the economy also affect them one way or another.
Indeed.
There are some food items that are produced in the rural communities and are available to those who live in the rural areas. But there are those that are also brought from the urban centers, like Prof has just spoken about the need to import paddy for milling. Basically, the major millers are in the suburban areas or urban communities. That's where you find the major millers in Nigeria. They're not found in the rural communities, essentially because they need electricity. They need the national grid to support their work. Otherwise, the cost of milling will be so high. So to that extent, the milled rice will have to be transported to the rural communities. Now, don't forget also that many of our rural communities are not really in the mainstream of the economy in the sense of issues of logistics and supply chains. And roads are generally very bad, and so many of the rural communities don't even have access to the urban communities. So the cost of moving things from the urban centers to the rural areas, even those that are very close to urban centers, the cost is generally very high. And so they bear the brunt as well. And so how they bear the brunt is, think about other food items, processed food items, generally I don't want to go into specifics, that have to be brought from where they are processed in the urban centers and brought to the rural areas. Generally speaking, the cost, how much you are going to buy a can of tomato in the city is not the same as how you're going to buy it in the rural area because it has to be transported. So when you build all these things in, you will see that it even hits them also a lot more when it comes to things that have to be taken to the rural areas, especially when you consider their earnings and generally, some other factors, like I said, transportation and stuff like that. Then, of course, another problem again is we talk about the issue of, he spoke about harvest and the fact that, what we're going to be looking at, this year. And he also made mention of something that has to do with flood, which we're going to talk about a little more elaborately. But the point I want to make here is that now there's a way these things work, and somehow the food production now, this is supposed to be the peak period of harvest and all of that. So a lot of losses, and those losses, who will absorb the losses? And then we should be talking about fiscal policies that will support the farmers now. The hectares, thousands of hectares or acres of rice, whichever measure you want to use, that had been submerged and had been destroyed now, how are the farmers going to be sorted out? How are they going to be compensated? We should then be talking about...
Because we don't have subsidies.
Exactly.
We don't have subsidies for
Correct.
farmers.
So this is a time for us to be talking about dry season irrigation farming now. And then we should begin to look at the communities all across the country, areas, especially in the floodplains where this rice is being produced, that can actually be brought into the mainstream of this dry season production. Because we have at least in the past 10 years, 2012 specifically, when there was a flood of this proportion, immediately after the flood, a lot of money was made available from the federal government to the farmers for dry season rice farming. And that really helped to stave off what would have been serious food scarcity as a result of the flood and the damage to crops and all of that. And so he spoke about rice, which is grown in the floodplains. There are some other grains too that the farmers had to take advantage of their closeness to the major rivers. Many of them swept away now, and some of them, like corn, could also be provided for. But not to go into all those details because of time. Let me talk about I
was going to say, let me come back to you. Let me touch base again with Prof, and then I'll come back to our studio. So, Prof, just as you started off, explaining it all to us, it just occurs to me that this increase in the price of foods, aka food inflation that we're talking about right now, in the developed countries, I imagine it'll be an annoyance and irritation. But in developing countries such as ours here, it's a very grievous matter because it's the difference between hunger and just barely managing to survive. So I was wondering, we've just been told by Dr. Oyele here that, yeah, government actually came across, in some measure. Whether or not it is enough is another thing. But I wanted to ask you about the storage policy, because we hear in other regions and also in our region here that in times of good harvest, foods that can be are stored. And so when we have times like, these, then some of that is released. I don't know if that is relevant in this whole conversation, the policy and indeed the extent to which we've been able to store for a rainy day, so to speak, or for that matter, a floody day.
Yeah, releasing of strategic reserve is very important to mitigate short-term shortages and rapid rise in the price. Because if you begin to experience a rapid rise in the price of rice, for it, there's a reason why I'm focusing on rice, because we have invested hundreds of billions of naira on the transition from import to export on rice. And we encouraged a lot of millers, poured a lot of money into it. And then we have millions of farmers now, almost 3 million or more, actually doing rice now. So it's so critical because that's the biggest import that we have in the country. So now, if you release the strategic reserves now, it's going to discourage those who are going to want to smuggle and import rice. The lower price, maintaining low price levels, it's been jumping up every day. From 25 to 27 to 30, I bought rice 2 days ago and I bought at 35,000. I watched local rice. It's going to 40.
That is a bag.
And it's going to go
a 50 kg bag of rice.
A bag, a 50 kg bag, yes, is already hitting 40. Now, the thing is this, if you don't stem that with the release of strategic reserves.
Oh.
Okay, it froze. And we will soon get the prof back. Okay. But I saw you nodding as the prof was speaking, meaning that you were actually in lockstep with him.
Sure. So I can even continue while waiting for him to resume. That, yes, of course, there's a need for us to make sure that we don't allow this gap, because it's going to discourage the millers who had invested a lot. And rice happens to be one of the biggest staples that we consume in this country on a daily basis. And so it's very important, like he is saying. But there's a word of caution I want to give. We are moving into election period. And if we are not very careful how we go about making provision for rice importation, it's going to be hijacked by, political bigwigs. And that is going to be a problem. So similar thing happened about 10 years ago. And we should not allow a repeat of such now. And we may...
When you say hijacked by political players, how did that work?
Right. Of course, you know that import licenses would have to be given, and then approvals and all of that. And it's those at the corridor of power that would tend to strategically position themselves. They may not be the primary importers, but they would be they make themselves the gatekeepers.
You mean government will allow that kind of a thing in this kind of an emergency?
We are human beings first and foremost. We are human beings first and foremost. So a lot of people seeing the opportunities, the pecuniary benefits there, would position themselves. Yes, of course, they may not be the ones that will import, but they may, like I said, make themselves the gatekeepers and decide to now collect whatever, approvals, form M or whatever, and then of course move on to those who are going to import and all of that.
There's that political aspect.
So there must be transparency and discipline here. So this is where our fiscal policy had to be properly thought out and implemented, and that's very, very important. And then maybe at this point I can now talk about the issue of storage generally that Prof was trying to talk about, because we really need to step up issues having to do with our storage facilities, cutting across various commodities. Because generally speaking, like one thing I would not want to omit here is to talk on a big picture of climate change as it affects our food production generally. Because now we are having a cyclical alternation between flood and drought. And so we need to factor this into our consideration also, because if I get what he was trying to say right, after this flooding season comes drought.
Yes.
And so if we don't make provision, if we don't take advantage of when the flood subsides now and we quickly get into dry season rice farming support those who will produce locally while we are making provision for importation, then there's going to be a problem. But I also want to bring a middle of the road suggestion also.
Okay,
which has
very,
to,
very briefly, because Prof has come back online.
right, okay.
Maybe I can go back.
Yeah, go back to you.
Okay, Professor Ife, we're glad
yes.
we're glad to have you back. I think the name, whatever it
Yes,
was,
yes.
dropped. So you were explaining at the time, if you recall. Can you please pick it up again?
Right, what I was explaining is this. We have a policy, a deliberate policy of backward integration. And that means that we are very minded, like we did in cement. We are doing the same in rice. If you are going to process rice, put the capacity here, and then also grow the rice, you must have priority. You must have priority over any policy shift. You must have priority, because the two priorities are, if you look at some of these farms I've just mentioned to you, I mentioned 4. I've mentioned Nolam that does over 10,000 hectares. You have Wakot and I have Onyx. They all have over 25,000 kg of tons of rice that are milling. Nolam is 36,000 tons of rice that are milling. So not only that they have calamity in the rice fields, that they are all flooded, they are not only losing workers and losing input, but they're also going to be chastised on the production side. So these are the people you must give license now to go and bring in paddy, not bring in finished rice. Finished rice will bring imported inflation, but to bring in paddy for them to process as a stopgap and keep the jobs. And then without the storm, they're already having huge losses on their farms. So, and also the strategic reserve will build that gap. While they are taking 6 weeks to bring in paddy, you release strategic reserves to stem the rapid rise in the price of rice.
Yes.
This very minute in the market. Mm-hmm. That is going on right now. But you mustn't allow them to compete. You give license to politicians, you destroy this economy. Because the inflation is so high now that what will happen in the next 2 months will push the inflation to 23-24%.
Indeed.
If you don't do what I'm suggesting, to release strategic reserve, to stem the price. Don't forget, we are even moving to the highest point of inflation, which is Christmas of December. So you've got to stop this. Otherwise, what will happen is that every Dikahada will grab license and politicians, they will import, and then you have issues.
Okay.
Then you will not stop them because they are going to be buying $1 from black market and importing and bringing it through the porous border. But officially, get these people that are doing over 10,000 tons processing, and let them have this, targeted paddy import license to keep their capacity, and you don't lose the job, and then you lose the farmers at the same time. Indeed. You don't want to do that.
Okay, all right. Dr. Yele, in the short term, I think Professor Ife said that, yeah,
we're in agreement. We're in agreement.
In the short term, but we can't go, too far with that. It's a stopgap measure for emergencies. Talking of which, how good are the reserves? I mean, what can we say about the reserves? Do we have substantial reserves, or is it a work in progress? And what kind of things are preserved? Is it grains only that are preservable? I imagine perishables are not as easy to preserve.
Yeah, definitely perishables are out of the equation. They're mostly the staples. In some cases, tubers. In some cases, most cases, grains. And then, of course, it depends on the location, in the country. Right now, I don't have an idea of what is stored and how much of it is stored right now. But I believe that the grain reserve, generally still have some,
grain,
things.
That is maize, rice, millet,
and the quantum I may not be able to talk about now. But again, this is a time also to do an inventory of whatever we have, and then begin to think about, first and foremost, those who have been displaced by the flood need to be our immediate priority now.
It's part of it.
So how do we target them? So government should be thinking about that. And then, of course, I remember also during the time of COVID-19, there was a mechanism that was put in place to get some, food items and stored and all of that. How do we get this also? And because one, like Prof was trying to talk about, generally speaking, once there's a gap, and that's actually what will, enable an increase in price, because we speculate, human beings generally speculate, and there will also be those individuals who will hoard some large quantity of food items and all of that. So we must make sure that we avoid a situation in which we allow such kind of gaps to play out. Otherwise, it will actually complicate. When he's talking about those figures, I'm actually, I'm receiving it with some kind of trepidation because it's worrisome for what will happen the next 2 months to the end of this year now. So I think, generally speaking,
because the food inflation, as our caption indicates, has been rising for every month for the past 7 months. And Prof was just explaining that, look, the real inflation season is coming. We know December.
That's right. So basically, I think all hands need to be on deck. All hands need to be on deck now, especially by people in authority. And this is in fact, it's an emergency of some sorts. So we need to talk about how not to allow this inflation to get out of hand, because we will see many undesirable consequences, people stealing, violence here and there. And if care is not taken, people might take to the streets too.
Indeed, because we read about that in other countries.
Well, it's not impossible, because when people are hungry and desperately so, the next thing for them is to vent their anger publicly. So I think the authorities must begin to think about how to stave off this now.
Professor Ife, how far away are we? Comfortably far away from the scenario Dr. Oyeleye paints, where it's gotten so bad that people are just besides themselves with desperation. I mean, hopefully we're a far place away from that. But what can be done in addition to whatever your answer is?
Well, first of all, the livelihoods are being threatened now. Our extreme poverty figures are going to worsen. Our trading balance will worsen. Our balance of payment will worsen. And this is hitting the base of our economic pyramid. 60% of our employment is in agriculture. A good proportion of those are all farming in the 12 river basins. River basin is known to be the base for rice because rice needs water. Other crops are doing well, but they're not, they are not in the league we are talking about right now. So that's why it's a catastrophe that is waiting to happen. And I think we ought to rise to this challenge immediately. There is we have two types of reserves. We can have paddy reserves. If you remember when we did the rice pyramids, those were paddies in the reserve, and they were being, before they are being released to millet. Then you can also have a milled rice in the reserves. So I think we need to do both. Release the milled rice into the price to stabilize prices, and then release the reserves of paddy straight to the millers to keep the job going.
Okay.
Why then issue selective license to the likes of Dangote? Is got a very strong one. You have Royal Stallion, but one of the biggest one, about 20% of it, is actually happening with Olam. So we need to encourage them and give them something to bring in additional paddy.
All right, we're talking about effectively food shortage, but actually it's food inflation, which sometimes can almost mean the same thing. Mr. Momo has called in from Maryland. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Yori. Good morning, Dr. Yori.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please. You had a comment or a question? Go ahead, please. Did I lose Mr. Momo in Maryland? Okay, and apologies to Mazi Okora for that. Also got in just before we went on break, but it wouldn't have been enough for Mazi to have, delivered the goods as he usually does. So Mazi, please, if you can call back, we really would be highly appreciative. And as for Mr. Momo, I don't know what happened there. But back in, is that Mr. Momo?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Momo, go ahead, please. You're on air right now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you see, we're having food crisis everywhere around the world. We see protests around the world. We can see.
We now lost you finally.
So maybe we'll begin to talk about the global situation.
Well,
which is actually a reason why we need to really guide our own environment. Because
if people were to say that Okay, Prof, you're talking about the global situation. My little corner in Nigeria here, please talk to me about that one, but I'm sure it's going to be connected, right?
Right. There's that, global connection. Now, we're talking about having to import. Do I know what the situation is with India, with Thailand and co? Now, about a month
Forgive
ago...
me for interrupting you, Prof.
Yes.
The Mazi Okorafor that we lost,
online.
he has called back
Okay,
again.
all right, okay.
Good morning, Mazi Okorafor. Thank you for calling back.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, Prof.
Good morning, sir.
Let's look at this issue. In terms of food production, food supply, anything we call it, food security in Nigeria. The major thing most of these farmers are using in Nigeria is fertilizer. And in Nigeria, the scarcity of fertilizers, a bag of fertilizer, you really want to talk about the quality wise, it's over 20-something thousand naira, which is not supposed to be that. There is need for government to subsidize all these fertilizers. Where possible, if the political zones we have start producing their own fertilizer, quality ones to help the farmers. And security of the farmers is very, very important. Very, very important. Because if you don't protect the farmers, many of them will be judged. That is why you see all these food controls there. Now we run to the farm, throw and throw. Now, how do we solve this one? Like this flood we are facing today. The flood we are facing, I think there is need. If there's a way government can do that emergency dam to reserve this water, so that during dry season farming, it will help the farmers, because some areas in Nigeria, they are ready to do dry season, but the water to take and do the plant is always a problem. So, thank God, flood is coming. Flood is already ground, but how do we reserve this water? Are we going to send it to the desert, to Sahara, to keep the water for farming? Nobody knows. We, the government. And the storage facilities is another problem Nigeria is facing. So, thank God for the Lagos state government. At least all that, I think, this last 1 or 2 months ago, they did something like that by the storage facility in Lagos. Now, what does it take other state governors to do that? All these perishable things, if we can do that, it will help us. Now, that's what the prof was saying. Honestly speaking, a quarter bag of rice, local rice, is 7,000 to 10,000 naira. Why must it be so? As long as 80% or 90% of Nigeria, they consume rice. Any house is my Mosano will tell you that that in their own house, every Sunday is Sunday rice. So if they say house, maybe it's no rice on Sunday, the children will not be happy. So this rice, which means 90% of Nigerians consume rice. Government should actually see what they can. And the seedlings is very, very good. But the question is this, these seedlings we are having in Nigeria, some of them are good, but I prefer these seedlings from Israel. If you have Israeli seedlings, the quality you get after production, it helps you. Even the farmers will just also make their money. Let us consider.
Thank you very much, Mazi Okorafor. Please continue.
He made some point, but let me first of all finish what I was talking about before he came in. Now, it's a global issue, but the question is this. Now, about 6 weeks ago, Pakistan had flood, and they needed a lot of help. One of the major things they needed, actually, is food. Now, you tell me, they share borders. Actually, Pakistan and India, they are just one. Just post 1947, they split into two. So if you ask me, they will be more inclined to sending food, to sending rice, wheat, and stuff like that to the neighboring Pakistan than they will want to send to us. So the question is this: with other countries of the world having these food crises, how are we sure that we will even get enough to purchase by way of paddy to come and mill here? That's an issue. He spoke about security. I knew we were going to get to talk about security because it has been a major issue. Many people ran away from farms because of insecurity.
Indeed.
I have a farm in Ogun State that I couldn't go to. I abandoned the place after harrowing, planting, and all of that because of insecurity. Had to leave the farm, and because there's one name in Igbo land, Ndobuisi.
Okay.
That means life is the head.
Yeah.
So life means more, than yes. So for that reason, many people had run away from farms, and that has its own, aggregate impact on food production. So that adds to these present problems that we are looking at. So I think I just need to put that also in perspective.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Mr. George, good morning, sir, and thank you for holding on. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Uncle Yori. Good morning to you and your guests.
Good morning.
Uncle Yori, I listened to the economic statistics rolled out by the professor. I am somebody who is interested in solving the problem from the roots, not from the top. The actual cause of inflation, double-digit inflation, Kuyori, had been with us before this rain, before this flooding, and before insecurity. If you look back, you see that double digits had been with us before that. Why is it that in most developed countries that are also crying out about inflation, they are not having double digits? The point I'm trying to make is, let us look at the moral aspect of the cost of prices, high prices. In the past, people used to be empathic to each other in this country. You go to the market now, Koyori, and buy a bowl of pepper for 200 naira. You go in the evening, the same person you met will say it is now 300 naira. You say, why? Say, my landlord said he's going to increase his rent next month. Sometimes they will tell you, Salah is coming. I have to look for my own money to buy ram. Where does humane consideration come in all of this? It is very clear that everybody wants to pass the buck without that element of sacrifice that makes life bearable for communities and peoples.
I hear you.
That is beginning. That has become absent in our society. Why don't we also address that aspect?
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. George.
What will now solve the problem?
Okay. Appreciate your calling in on that, Mr. George. Let me take it straight to Professor Ken Ife. Professor,
I'm listening.
To what extent does economics, allow for, as Mr. George was putting it, moral aspects in a capitalistic environment? Are there some sections called morals in economics?
Well, I think I'm not sure about the morality aspect because we are running a market economy. What I do know is that there are market imperfections in our economy, which is caused by what I call the political economy of it, which is where politics overrides a lot of drags or dictates a lot of private interests that supersede the national interest. And then secondly, you also have market behaviors that are inevitable. For example, you have hoarding of goods. Just because they see flood, they begin to hoard rice. Right. And then that means they induce artificial scarcity well ahead of the time, and they start creaming up the prices. Then they hear that there's likelihood to be settlement or paying a higher wage, raising minimum wage. Just the hearing that it is likely to happen, the market reacts immediately. They want to get their own minimum wage. They hear the petrol price is increasing, they raise their price so that they can get their own petroleum. So all of those are market behaviors that you can hardly do very much about. We don't have price control, so it boils down to demand and supply. Correct. So that is why we try to build local capacity to be able to produce the raw material and process the raw material and stay here and fight it out with them. Those who are importing, we're even in greater danger because they'll go and buy their dollar today and then they import and they'll pass through all that high price to the consumers. And when you come, they say they bought the dollar, 750 naira to $1. But last month they bought it to 700 and it keeps going up and up and up and up. And then Christmas season is coming in and salad season, all of them add to the hype. So it's a very unfortunate situation, but that's what we live with.
All right.
The only way you deal with it in a sustainable way is to produce what you eat. And then eat what you produce.
Okay, and that is an objective we have not met yet. Mr. Mukhtar in Kano, good morning and thank you for holding on. Go ahead,
hello.
Sir.
Good morning, Uncle Yori. How are you doing?
Good morning. Very well, thank you.
Good. My contribution to this program is that you see, food is very essential to human beings. Hello.
We can hear you.
Food is very essential for human beings to survive. But one of the factors that this government, the government policy, has been faulted for so many things. One is that the insecurity issue made inflation of the food items to be rising because there is no feed for the farmers to go to the farm. That's one thing. The bank rate, when you make a loan from the bank, they give you 2 digits, which you cannot afford. And that is multiplying the effect of, you see, the critical inputs that the farmers need. And another thing is that the government should have think twice. See, one of the things that I respect Shagari's government is that the Green Revolution policy, which they introduced, which had helped Nigerians to abate hunger and calm down inflation as far as food items are concerned, are very important. I thought this government would pick the essential thing, the important policy, so that they incorporated it into their own. Because doing it this way may not help matters. And one thing is that when this government came, they said they closed the borders. Now, in times like this, critical times like this, you have to open the borders to supplement, the one that has been produced in Nigeria, so that there may be competition in terms of the prices. And when the prices is down, the common man will be happy. And that's why we voted for this government. But at least they have neglected the agricultural policy. They want on giving 5,000, 10,000 to people. That will not solve the problem. That will not solve. It will even increase the problem rather than solving the problem. Giving somebody 5,000, 10,000, you can spend it within an hour. But if you empower him to do something, at least that will help him to stand on his own. And then he can be a productive person.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mukhtar, for calling in from Kano. He spoke there about, so it really goes to show that our leaders have known about the urgency of this issue. He spoke about the Green Revolution, and Operation Feed the Nation,
yes.
Remember? Yes. I think it goes back to Obasanjo as a military person in government at the time. I don't know, is it that wasn't sustained, or it was sustained and modern exigencies overtook whatever the intention was?
Yeah, I think successive governments came up with their own new ideas, and they jettisoned those they met on the ground. And I think that's not good, because one of the things that should actually, there was a time in this country when we had rolling plans. And, so if we really followed something like that, then of course it means before we come up with something new, even if there's a change of government, what is presently being implemented under the rolling plan will still have to continue. So then you can gradually introduce changes. But the abrupt, changes being introduced, under these various governments actually had been a major problem. There have been many good policies on paper, or some of them under implementation, but because of changes in government, they were just abandoned and thrown away. For instance, there was agricultural transformation agenda under the previous government of GEG. There's nothing out of place if that continued. But over time, it was stopped, and there was no continuation. Then we began to have other versions that really hadn't made much of it, a difference.
Professor Ife, to what extent do you think policy shifts through the ages, through the decades, have contributed to what both of you have described as a dire situation that we find ourselves in? Can policy shifts also be, take its blame in this, or is it just bad luck?
No, in the 60s, we had a complete grip on the agricultural production system and the export contribution that it was making. And that was down to incentivizing the regions who now had thousands of hectares of plantations, and it was working well for them. But as soon as oil came in the early 70s, the federal government withdrew those incentives, those tax incentives to the regions. And so they no longer had any interest. The states don't have any interest again. They allowed all their plantations to die because there was no more fiscal incentive for them. Rather, we embraced import of food, and then federal became a big player in agriculture, and then they were spending hundreds of billions buying fertilizer and giving it to worker people and all that stuff, and politicians entered and took over. So that is what actually caused the decline. People keep saying it's oil money. Oil didn't do anything. What happened was that it started happening when oil came in.
Okay.
So the main incentive was taken away. Now, if you look through the whole generations of various green revolutions and all of that, What is not sustainable about that is the funding structure. So it is only now that we have anchor borrowers program that is actually sustainable if it is implemented, because it went to get 5 million farmers, give them credit with no collateral. It's never happened in our country before. We never even have 100,000 farmers that got money with no collateral. 5 million got it with no collateral, and they're able to deliver over 5 million hectares. All they needed to do was to start repaying the loan, because this is not money from government. This is money from the banking sector. Money for me and you that put money in the banking sector. So they needed to understand that just pay that little money after your 90-day rise, and then you get more, and it will continue to flow. Don't think it is palliative. Of course, it's not palliative. Okay. And when they begin to miss that, then they're going to have more trouble in the horizon.
Okay.
Because private sector money cannot be given to you for you not to repay it.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Prof. Mr. Oseni in Jos, thank you for holding on. Go ahead now, please.
Yes. Good morning, Uncle Yori.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for calling in.
Yes. The issue of anchor borrower, just like the professor is talking about, I am in Plateau State. Those monies are given to people that are not supposed to even get access to the money. The whole process is being politicized. How will you give money? You say anchor borrower, you give money to somebody instead of the money to go to the farmers, those who are really into farming, to supplement the problem that we are facing with food, or food issue. You go and give money to somebody because you know who is a trader. You take money to those people that have no concern with the farming. And that's why you see that even the anchor borrower, they cannot even pay back the money because the money is not being given to the right people. Talking about other interventions, Plateau State, example, my own state, Plateau State, Southern Senatorial Zone of Plateau State are known for farming. The whole local government, their yam, rice, and everything that you are seeing, it comes from Plateau State to even to Lagos, ask them. But the whole money that are given as aid, you cannot even see about 5 or 10 people that are accessing those kind of aid in Plateau State. Why? Because that is politics. They don't give them. They take the money, give to people that are living inside not just south, those people that are not even farming. They use that money for nothing. And at the end of it, how do you expect the food to be sufficient?
Okay.
When we are not using the right people to supplement the whole process.
Okay, Mr. Oseni, thank you very much for calling in. Did you?
Yeah, my take. Yes, sure. My take on anchor borrowers. Mr. Oseni from Jos has actually stated, part of it, because I was actually wondering when Prof was talking about, the implementation of anchor borrowers scheme. Perhaps what Prof was trying to say was, if I got him right, was if it was well implemented. But as to implementation, there are a lot of hiccups with the implementation of anchor borrowers scheme. Like he said, like Mr. Oseni said, yes, there's a high rate of default, and many of the recipients are not supposed to be beneficiaries of this.
I was it's a ridiculous comparison perhaps, but
yes,
look at the new initiative to address, the oil thieves. The revelations that are coming out from there,
mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling,
Yes.
It's corruption-laden and all of that.
Correct, yeah.
Now, I don't know, as I said, it's a ridiculous comparison, but if that kind of an open eye, let it all hang out attitude that was brought to confronting oil thieves now, if it could be brought to this, might it not help? Because we're talking about political manipulation of all the devices
it really can
that
help.
we've tried to erect.
It really can help, but the question you want to ask is who will bail the cat? Because one, as a matter of fact, the money involved in anchor borrower scheme is huge. And then, of course, those that would implement going after the beneficiaries.
Yes.
This is one of the things. And then, of course, because those who are powerful in government know a lot about how this anchor borrower scheme money is being distributed. So for that reason, it might be pretty difficult. Actually,
distributed and even use the word abused.
Abused, yes, of course. And then, of course, there's a high rate of default. The repayment is actually problematic. That's one thing. In addition, even to that, there's another program called NISAL, Nigeria Incentive Based Risk Sharing in Agricultural Lending, NIRSAL. The same thing to many farmers that were brought into that program are seriously complaining today that there's a group of farmers in Lagos here that really, their hopes were dashed because of, how that was implemented. We cannot be going into some of those details here. So the truth about it is that laudable, on paper, and but in reality, in implementation, and human factors are largely responsible for this.
Okay, Professor Ife, we're hearing these things, and we by now we have a sense that a lot of the programs that we come up with, such as some that have been mentioned by Dr. Oyeleye, we know that implementation is key, and government knows, government knows all about it, even when it is being misimplemented. I don't know. Since it's an emergency, has the time not come for us to bring the same kind of, seriousness of purpose that now appears to be the case in confronting oil thieves to this as well? Because this is arguably equally, if not more important, food. Okay, Prof, okay. Is not there.
Yeah, basically.
But this whole matter about sincerity.
Yes.
It's always been a problem, right?
That's right.
Because very soon we'll hear that they didn't know, as has been tried to be offered to us in the case of oil theft.
Yes. No, basically, I think it's known because some insiders actually had been raising dust, about it. But then, of course, the question now is, who actually will lead that?
Who will build the camp?
Exactly,
which you said.
Yes, this is a very.
Why is it a politically? It is politically delicate.
Right? Yes. Then of course, I will also need to add this, that many state governments also are part of this, would have been saying, okay, let the subnational government also get involved in agriculture in practice, because the Constitution actually gives them that a prominent role because of the position of states. But the question is, are they also doing what they need to do?
Well, again, that's a fine place to leave it. It's a bit of are they? So let it be open-ended. And I think there are many that will say, Prof, Doctor, you dropped a rhetorical question. Most people will say, we know the answer, but these things must be proved. Yeah. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Olukayode Oyeleye, consultant and policy analyst, and also the fact that you've been a former senior special advisor to two, no less, successive ministers of Agric. And then our appreciation also goes to Professor Ken Ife. Professor Ken Ife is a development economist. Thank you very much as well, Prof, even though, again, the internet has done what it does from time to time. But thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, too, as well. So thank you, gentlemen. Okay. Indeed, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Please join us tomorrow for another engaging topic. I am Yori Folarin. Bye-bye for now.